Hello friends, it's Barbara Sue at Kowalski Mountain, and today we are back in Kentucky and I am doing some more canning today. Now today's video is going to be a little bit different. I'm not going to talk so much about what I'm making, but I'm going to talk to you about the process of using the water bath canner. When it comes to home canning, canning safety is actually quite controversial in the homesteading world. Over time, canning guidelines have changed, and techniques that we used to consider to be common techniques have changed over the time, and that's done through research and increased knowledge, and also the changing in the products that we have available to us for canning. And so for the purpose of this tutorial, I am going to be only sharing safe home canning techniques. And this book by the USDA, it's called The Complete Guide to Home Canning, and it's done by the National Institute of Food and Agriculture. And this book is considered the guidelines by the USDA for all home canning. Now on a private sector, the Ball book, which has been out since 1909, is actually also considered a very well balanced instruction manual as well. So whenever I do any of my canning, I always refer to my USDA home canning guide for the processing times and information I need to know to process our food safely. Now there are two types of canning methods. We have water bath canning and pressure canning. And today we're going to talk about water bath canning. Water bath canning is appropriate for foods that are high in acid or can have acid added to them to make the levels appropriate for safe water bath canning. Our applesauce is done in the water bath canner, salsa, pickles, jellies, foods like that are done in the water bath canner. And whenever I have a question of which process to use, I always refer to my book to help me determine what's the best process. Now, right now on my burner over here, I have my water bath canner going and I'm sterilizing my jars. Now, modern technique has determined that sterilization of jars is not necessary if your processing time is going to be longer than 10 minutes, and ours is going to be. I'm going to be honest, I just like to do it. It still makes me feel good, and I go ahead and I process those jars. Now it also means that my jars are hot and ready to go, and I won't have any problems with pressure shock between the hot applesauce that I'm going to be canning today and the jars to break them. So that's been going for a little while. My applesauce is about ready and we're going to get started, and I'm going to take you step by step for the steps for proper water bath canning. Time's up, the jars are done processing, and we can start processing our applesauce. I've gone ahead and I've turned off the heat on my water bath canner. And now I'm going to just lift the jars out of the water, and this is the jar lifter that comes with my water bath canner. Now if you don't have a water bath canner at home, you can still water bath can your foods, and that is different than pressure canning. Pressure canning does require a specific piece of equipment, but water bath canning, we don't need to do that. We can use any large pot that's big enough to submerge the jars at least 1 to 2 inches below the surface of the water. Now, a water bath canner makes that very easy because I have a rack, and it allows me to move my jars up and down into the water, and it's easier to handle them. Now, if you don't use a water bath canner, you do need to put something in the bottom of the pot so that the glass jars are not sitting directly on the bottom of the pot. You can use a towel in the bottom of the pot, separate the glass jars from the heat source, but there needs to be something there to allow the jars not to sit directly on the bottom of the pot. Now we're going to let these sit for about 5 minutes. Just let them come to stabilization with the air temperature before we continue. While we give those a few minutes to get used to the air temperature, I've lifted the jars out of the water so they're getting the coolness of the air out here. We're outside today in the outdoor kitchen, which I love canning outside, with one minor exception. Yellow jackets are not my friend, and so if you see me chasing off yellow jackets, that's why. Now, water bath canning doesn't require a lot of specialized equipment. I do recommend the home canning guide done by the USDA, and this book is actually free as a PDF download. Now, if you want it in a spiral bound version, color printed like what I have, you can purchase the book, but you can also get it for free through the PDF online, and I'm going to be sure to link that in my post. Now, some of the equipment that's really necessary: you need a large pot, large enough to submerge your jars by 1 to 2 inches. A jar lifter, I consider this highly necessary. It's very hard to handle the glass jars when they're hot without this. So minimum required equipment, I would consider this one of those. A canning funnel. This has a large opening at the bottom, and it allows me to easily fill my jars without making a mess all over the rim of the jars. A large ladle is used to fill the jars. This will make your job a lot easier as well. Now, this is also a Headspace tool and a bubble tool. And this tool, I would consider this optional. You could view the Headspace visually, or you could use a ruler that you have at home. And for the bubbles, you could use a stick. Some people use a chopstick or a plastic spatula to get the bubbles out. I have purchased this. It is useful to check my Headspace. It has the steps that show me the Headspace measurement, but I would consider this an optional tool. Now, you also need a clean cloth to clean the tops of the jars as you're canning. And then, of course, you need clean canning jars. Now, your jars do not need to be new. We reuse all of our ball canning jars, and you just clean them and sterilize them between each use. The same with the rings. The rings can be reused. This is used to hold the lid on during the processing. Now, what needs to be new are your canning lids, and these are one use. And this is an area in the canning world where people debate the importance of having fresh canning lids. I always use new canning lids for my canning. Now, you can also use reusable lids. There are 2 companies that produce reusable lids for canning, and those are considered safe canning. They have a separate rubber ring that is reusable, and then a plastic cover that is used for the canning, and those are USDA safe and reusable. But today we're going to be using the metal. I will do a second video in the future showing how to use the reusable canning lids. Also, some of your standard equipment, you need towels, pot holders, things like that, just so you can handle the hot equipment. You also do need a towel on your work surface. Now, why do we need that towel? So the jars are hot, and I'm filling them with hot liquid. Now, I'm working on a plastic table, but if you were working on a stone countertop at home, you could cause temperature shock between the hot jars and the surface of your table. So that's why you use a towel to absorb some of that temperature and protect your glass jars. That's it. Your canning supply list for water bath canning is quite minimal. Now I'd say we're almost ready to get started filling our jars. Well, let's get started. Now, if I was working at home, in my kitchen at home, I would probably take all of the jars out of the water bath canner and line them up here on the counter. But I'm working outside today, and I've found that the jars cool down way too quickly for me to take out all the jars. So I just take them out one at a time, fill them up, and then put them back into the water bath canner to keep the jars hot. So let's get started. So first I'm going to put my canning funnel right inside of my glass jar. I'm going to fill my jar, and I need a 1/2 inch of headspace. So what is headspace? Headspace is the space between the top of the food and the top of the jar. Now the reason that headspace is important is because it ensures that there's the proper amount of space in the jar for the jar to seal properly. Let's check our headspace to see how we're doing. We need a 1/2 inch of headspace. So the way this works is every step is a 1/4 inch. So I'm going to go here to the second step to show that I can still fill my jar about another 1/4 inch or so. So let's go ahead and add some more applesauce. Now next, I'm going to use my bubble tool to get the bubbles out of my jar. Now it's important to work out as much bubbles as you can during the canning process, and some foods are easier than others to get the bubbles out of. Now once we've gotten the bubbles out, we can check our headspace, and we still have more space. So let's add a little bit more applesauce. Now because I added more, I'm going to go ahead and check those bubbles again. And I'm going to use my headspace tool to check my headspace. And I'm right at perfect. I'm right at 1/2 inch. So the next step that we're going to do is we're going to clean the rim. Even though I've been careful, I've still contaminated the lid with a little bit of applesauce. So I just want to clean that off. And now I'm going to add a clean, new canning lid. Now I've washed these. Now it's no longer necessary to heat these in boiling water. Used to be you had to do that to make the sealant seal to the jar properly, but that's no longer needed. I'm just going to simply put it right on top. And I'm going to tighten my ring to finger tight. Now that's an important step, not to tighten your ring too tight. So the way that it's going to work when the water bath canner starts, any air that's left inside the jars is going to rise to the surface of the water. And even though I've put that ring and that lid on there, there is enough space that we can see bubbles sometimes bubbling out of the jars. That's extra air escaping the jars. Now, after I finish the processing time, that's different for each recipe, and we refer to our canning guide to determine how long we're going to process that. Once they're done, we take them out and we let the jars sit with the rings on for about 24 hours. And during that time, they're going to seal. Now, proper headspace is important. Too little headspace can force your food out of the jars through the lids, and that can contaminate your seals and affect your seals from completely sealing to store your food. Too much headspace can push liquid out, and then the jars might not seal because there's not that correct force inside the jar to make them seal. So that 1/2 inch headspace for this recipe is important, and we always check our book to determine what the proper headspace is. So I continue the process until all of the jars are full. I have to say, I love canning outside. I love being out here near the creek and listening to it. I love the burner. The big burner, that thing is awesome. Makes it so much easier. What I don't like is the yellow jackets. And so I've told Philip that we are going to need a screened room for outdoor canning when we're here permanently. Of course, that's not high on the priority list right now, but it's going to be on the list. So I filled my jar and I'm getting the bubbles out. Let's check my headspace. I feel like I'm a little over, so I'm just going to scoop a little bit out. And since I've made an adjustment, I'm going to recheck my bubbles and check my headspace. And I'm right there at 1/2 inch. That looks good. I'm going to clean the rim of the jar. I'm going to add a new lid and secure it with a ring. And back into the water bath canner it goes. So the final jar is filled. I'm going to go ahead and add that to my water bath canner. I got 9 pints in my water bath canner. I'm going to go ahead and lower the basket, and this is where the basket is really, really useful because it allows me to submerge the jars into the pot safely without burning myself or jostling the jars. And so that is one of the real perks of using a water bath canner. Now we're going to put the lid on this. I'm going to turn the heat on and get it rolling to a full boil. So the processing time doesn't start until the water comes to a full rolling boil. The water bath canner has come to a full rolling boil, so now it's time to start processing our jars. Now, according to the guide, for what I'm making today, I need to process my pint jars for 15 minutes at my altitude. If you live at an altitude over 1,000 feet, you do need to adjust your processing time to a longer time. So be sure to check the guide to determine the proper processing time for not only whatever the recipe you're making, but also the altitude that you live at. Well, the 15 minutes processing time is up. I'm going to go ahead and turn off the heat to my water bath canner. Now that the heat is turned off, I'm going to go ahead and remove the lid. And I'm going to lift up my jar lifter. Now that raises my jars up out of the deep of the water. They're still sitting in maybe 1 inch of water at the bottom. And now we're going to let these sit for 5 minutes. And the reason we're going to do that is because we want to kind of get these jars used to the air temperature outside before I remove them. That prevents temperature shock. So I'm going to set that timer for 5 more minutes. The timer has beeped, so the 5 minutes of resting is complete. Now we can go ahead and remove the jars from the water bath canner. I'm just going to line these up on a towel-lined surface. Again, that helps prevent temperature shock from the counter surface and the jar. If you just noticed there was a ping, that's the sound of the jar sealing once it sucks down with the sealant. Canners love to hear that delightful pinging of their jars sealing, meaning that these jars will be shelf stable on the shelf for 1 to 2 years. Now that the jars have all been removed from the water bath canner, we're going to let them just sit here. We don't tighten the rings, we don't press on the lids, we just let them sit and cool. And they do need to sit undisturbed for 24 hours. Once the 24 hours is up, I'm going to come back and show you what's next. Well friends, it's been 24 hours since we completed canning our water bath canned goods, and now it's time to finish the process. I'm going to remove the rings. Now the rings are only used during the canning process to hold the lid in place. Once complete, we remove the rings and we save these for later use. The lid is actually the sealed product that is keeping this shelf stable, and we want to check each lid and make sure it's secure. Now to do that, I'm just going to pull on it. Don't be afraid to put a little muscle into it and give it a good tug. You want each jar to be securely sealed to make this shelf stable. Now you'll want to check with the manufacturer of your lids for the determination of how long your canned goods are safe on the shelf, but they are good for at least 1 year. Now, if your jar did not seal, you can reprocess the jar with a new lid, or you can put it in the refrigerator and use it more quickly. The last step is going to be to label our products with the date and the name of the product. And I actually write right on the lid. That way I know this is a used lid and can't be used for canning again. This can be stored in my pantry in a cool, dry place for up to 1 year. Friends, I hope that you have enjoyed this tutorial. Please refer to the blog post on KowalskiMountain.com for the full written tutorial and the step-by-step photographs that accompany this video. Please also be sure to subscribe to both our blog and our YouTube channel by hitting that subscribe button, and like this video so that our channel will grow. Thank you so much for being part of the Kowalski Mountain family.